Hey, welcome to More Than Velocity podcast. I'm Ryan Croton. I'm here with Jordan Oseguera from our company. We're really excited to have Nick Serio here from Velocity University. If you live under a rock, you probably have not been hearing about how everything is revolving around velocity being the real cause of injury. But what I can tell you is that what they're doing at Velocity University with a data-based approach of looking at arm strength and how it's matching into their programs and they're individualizing their process is really the opposite of what people should be thinking with velocity because it can be done better. We're going to learn a lot from Nick in this podcast. And Nick, why don't you give us a little bit of background about yourself because he's actually Dr. Nick Serio, but he started something really cool out in the state of New York, and we're just happy to have you on here, buddy. So yeah, give us
I appreciate
an
it.
overview.
Appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, listen, VeloU is a training facility that was birthed out of a strength and conditioning facility. So my undergraduate is actually in kinesiology.
Mhm.
I went and then got my master's in, again, kinesiology, but it was more of a focus in motor learning. And then went and got my doctorate in performance psychology. The path to all of those was basically just trying to solve the next problem for the athletes I worked with, which was, hey, I can get them as strong as humanly possible, but if I don't understand how to teach them a skill or how to teach them to create skill acquisition, then I can't really get the full amount for them. Once we got to that point, I realized when these kids go and start playing in a game, I'm still missing the number one thing that's holding all of them back, which is understanding how to control their mental landscape. So our attempt is to always be data led, but understand that there are an enormous amount of variables and nuances that need to be accounted for within a training environment. And we try and account for as many as we possibly can for each athlete.
Yeah, I think it's amazing how you're managing a lot of kids there, but you have a systematic approach, to what you do. I mean, we saw the video bumper of all the assessments, that's been done um, at your facility, and it kind of rolls into our first, question. We're talking about this process of individualization. Like my heuristic is that generalization equals hospitalization, individualization, equals optimization. And I kind of wanted to kind of pick your brain on a day to day of how things can be individualized, like how you're using the arm care platform to put guys into different buckets. I mean, we've had these conversations offline, which is pretty cool, and you got a lot of data looking at scaling the work, but share some of that stuff with our
Sure.
audience. I think it'd be great.
Yeah. So it, every facility on the planet or every training platform or whatever it's going to be has to have a framework. You have to have a skeleton of where you're going, right? And then the artist or the craft becomes how you implement or so either add or constrain variables within that framework, right? And that's the individualization. And I think where arm care has stepped in so incredibly for us. And listen, I'm a person who we have tried just about every single device there is.
Mhm.
And when you look at, I mean, I think, what did I send you the other day? We have a database of 5,500 arm care tests over the last 3 years. So obviously we believe in this unit.
Yeah.
And what it does so well for us, and not to like come on this podcast and just be like, oh, rah, rah, arm care, like,
Hey,
but in
that's
all
okay.
honesty, what it does for us is it's a great indication of a response to a stimulus. The stimulus we're applying is training, right? We need to understand how is the athlete responding to what we're delivering. And we're constantly trying to look at, okay, did they recover? If they recovered, was the stimulus not enough? How do we know whether or not we can push forward? And I think ultimately what you always boil down to is this athlete prepared to do what we're asking them to do? And then when they do it, how did they respond? Okay, next day now. Now that we understand how they responded, how do we adapt the next level of this program to try and elicit either a greater or a pullback response from this? And then when you get into the weeds on it, and why I think we end up working with a lot of colleges from this capacity is using this device and this platform, is because what we can do for them is we can create a lot of that individualized nuance that they don't either have the time, the bandwidth, any of it. And we can come in and we can say, okay, hey, based on this test, we need to scale back and we need to implement X, Y, and Z training now moving forward in terms of this particular exercise because ER was down, IR was up, so on and so forth. And I think ultimately at the end of the day, it just does such a great job telling us how the athlete is responding to what we're being given.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, I
I
think.
took a couple
Go ahead.
notes there, and I think it's important because anyone who follows our social media, there's always like someone we're making angry for some reason, and we're not even like controversial, you know. But our big thing we always say is like you have to assess no matter what the implement is, you have to assess it. And like I said, I took a couple notes right there because you guys are saying you're layering on, you're making sure that you're not over or under doing what it is the goal is, but you're constantly assessing. Can you, I don't know if you're going to ask this question a little later on, Ryan, so I don't know if I'm jumping ahead here, but can you give everyone kind of listening an example of what that looks like on your guys' part? Just like if you're adding an A, how are you looking at to make sure that you're not overdoing the goal of what you're trying to do or exactly what you do there?
I think the easiest way to summarize this is like let's just say it's a high intensity velocity enhancement day. This is where people really want to think like they're putting a plyo ball of varying weights in guys' hands, they're running, gunning, but there's not that added layer of channeling. Like what happens on that high intensity throwing day at VeloU for our
Well,
audience?
yeah, so I actually think what's it, I mean, shoot, I can go 1,000 different ways right here, but I think one of the main problems with our industry is that we have been given paradigms by successful organizations, and then everybody tries to take that paradigm and just slightly shift it and call it their own, right? I think at the end of the day, we have a big problem that we believe those have to happen in phases, right? Because honestly, they need high intent exposure all the time. It's just, are they actually prepared to do that? What we have found over time, and you and I have talked at length on this, is that we actually have to be stricter the younger they are and the more successful they are. So if I have a kid who is, so we have those variables, right? Like who is the athlete? And Jordan, to answer your question, it's like, hey, is this guy a return to throw? Well, if he's in a return to throw, he's probably testing every day pre and post. If he is a pro athlete who has an unbelievable understanding of what's going on in his body and how he's recovering and everything, he might be testing only pre and post on the high intent days that we have him throwing, or a high volume day, right? If we have a younger athlete who is really good, in our perspective, that's the most dangerous athlete on the planet, right? We have a 14-year-old that can throw 91. That kid tests every day he comes in the building. There is never a point in time where he is not pre and post testing, because that is a very risky arm right there if it's not up to the strength metrics we're asking it to live at.
Yeah.
And his strength metrics in comparison to, let's say, a 220-pound pro athlete in our realm is way stricter. And he has to achieve so much higher just to be allowed to go into a high intent throwing day. So first and foremost, how we use it is to ensure that we're prepared. Next, it comes into how did they respond to that? And to your point, Jordan, let's say they finished their training session and it was a really high intent day, meaning like, they threw, let's say 10 throws at 100% or 110%, which is what we would call like any sort of aggressive momentum based movement, a running gun, pull down, you name it, right? If they're doing that and there was no fall off from the kid and everything remained exactly the same, so our perspective is, okay, the stimulus or the stress wasn't high enough to elicit any massive change. So we test the same theory again to make sure it occurs. If it occurred the same way and there was no massive change, we see, depending on the age, we see an opportunity to overload. If there was a big pullback and like, just really lost whatever, I think our margins are like 10%, right? Loss of 10% after one of those sessions, we're going to pull them back. And we may give, instead of a 7-day gap, now he's going to have a 10-day gap or a 15-day gap till the next time they expose. For you guys, you have to give systematic approaches, right? We follow a lot of those frameworks and then can develop nuances within them because we're in the weeds with these guys, right? So those nuances, that's the art of coaching. That's where that comes into play. But that's essentially how we end up using those. Now, as it goes into like the strengthening side of it and like how we regain some of those things, that's a lot of just tried and true practices of like, hey, when we get a guy who's experienced a big time deficit after a training program, right? We need to determine like if we can bring him back neurologically. So we might retest him. We have done this too. He comes out post throwing out of a high intent. We implement quite a bit of high intent isometrics and retest again.
Mm-hmm.
And what we've seen is a bounce back. And so we're like, okay, wow. So that was an incredibly neurologically taxing day for this kid. Let's see how we respond tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
And then now you go down the rabbit hole of like just trying to get him to figure out where base is. And then we're gradually trying to raise base all the time.
Yeah, I mean, you see guys like we see some guys that Jordan and we can solve for. And you'll notice that they're consistently having very high post exams, right?
Mm-hmm.
So people get really excited, they're in the 110%, but it's also letting us know that the neurological activation
They didn't get
likely
warm.
isn't good enough, right? Is like the throwing is what's getting their arm more active, right?
100%.
So that's kind of the opposite way too, and it's something we're building it into the premium app version of what we offer on the training side. But just like what you said, a lot of our training, okay, is going to start with the isometrics
It has to.
using the actual, yeah, the strength tester function, getting some kind of even graded strength tests that might not even have to be maximal. You can program somebody to say, hey, I want 50% of this, and the dynamometer is telling you what 50% would be.
I mean, we utilize the unit as well as an actual training implement,
Yes.
especially the app, because of the fact that it gives the feedback of how hard they're pushing. We had a
Yep.
kid that could not get his IR strength numbers up if he did a singular test. Then when he would do 3, it would go marginally up. So what I started doing to him was we cannot progress away from internal rotation until you've given me enough tests where you start going down neurologically. And before we knew it, this kid started, I'm being honest, was hitting in the realm of like a 28 on IR strength. You're talking about a 220-pound kid. A 28 on IR strength.
28%, yeah,
28%
28%
to
body and
hitting 58, 60, 65 out of nowhere, like 6 tests in, and then would start to go down. So what we're trying to get him to understand is like, understand how much you have to prime this just to get your body neurologically prepared to go and throw. And
yeah.
by now all of a sudden we found back the velo that we all of a sudden during the season, where did this go?
Yep.
And I just don't understand people's negligence, the player, to like, you had this big velo drop. Do you think it just came out of nowhere? Like, you have the ability to test and figure out why. You have a number. Don't ignore it because you don't understand how to fix it. Use that information and go and conquer it.
It's scary that
Yeah,
there are guys walking around like that, not
well,
know. It's frightening.
and there's so much information out there, and I think there's this rift in baseball, and I think it's getting closer to almost seeing each other's point of view to where you have the I am anti-data, anti-tech, and I am pro-data, pro-tech, and they think that they're all pulling in different directions when in reality everybody kind of wants the same thing, which is to build what's best for the player.
Mhm.
I think we're getting closer, but there's still enough distance that it's a difficult gap to cover. Um,
I think
and
that's
I
'cause
I have a hard
everybody
time
wants.
understanding the bridge of that. Say that
Yeah,
again.
I think that's just because everybody wants the answer, and they want the answer to be a number, and they want it to be very simple. Um, we had a kid the other day. He had a motion capture. They sent us it. He had one metric that was like a massive outlier in terms of where he was positioned, torso wise on the mound, and meaning outlier that he wasn't in the MLB norm. His stuff is off the charts. He struggles throwing strikes a little bit. Their answer was, oh, we have to fix this postural setup. My answer, my rebuttal back was, okay, how are you going to do that? And it was like these 3 drills. I'm like, what if I were to tell you he's done 1,000 of those same drills already? So now
Yeah.
what? Now how are you going to solve it? Are you just going to that metric because it's tangible? It's easier, right? Most of the reason I will be hard pressed outside of an injury or an injury that is unaware of, for you to show me a movement-based deficiency that's causing an accuracy issue. I just don't believe it. I believe that it has to be an inner variable. That's something that is going on from a psychological perspective that is preventing this individual from actually being accurate. And
Yep.
the ignorance to state that velocity is the antithesis of accuracy is just ridiculous. And that is basically most people's argument, right? Why do you teach these kids to throw harder? I teach them to throw harder because it's a barrier to entry. Somebody please tell me a college coach who's going to get on the phone with me when I have a kid throwing 85 and he's in the portal. It's not going to happen.
Hmm.
So if I need him to be over that, then that's my barrier to entry. Accuracy, that's a given. If you're not accurate, you're not what's called a pitcher. You're just a thrower. So
Hmm.
that is a segment that, yes, obviously it's being worked on, but we can't forget the fact that the barrier to entry is still and will always be velocity because of what it does to a hitter.
So I'm going to tell you why you're successful. And it's because you are at the interaction of arm speed and arm strength. One of the things that happens is that when athletes are in a kind of an unmanaged velocity enhancement program where there's no attention to arm strength, they're relying a lot on stretch shortening, a lot of
Mhm.
stretching of passive tissues, and their arm speeds, they accelerate really high. But the problem is, at ball release, there is a fixed position that the arm has to be to have consistency in the release point. So you imagine with arm fatigue, that position is going to be all over the place. So it makes it really difficult to have that speed accuracy trade-off when you have them both together and you're like, hey, scaption strength isn't where it should be. And I know my guy, like he's not a 3/4 arm. He's a little bit more over the top, and we're seeing something that's changing in his release point or he's tilting. You're catching those things by fixing the arm. And now you have, that arm speed or arm force together. So you're putting the arm in the position it needs to be. It's grooved in that track of how it throws. It stops on a dime, and like that consistency, the whole body, like maybe this trunk situation, it's like what you're saying. It's all interdependent. There's
Yeah,
other elements that are
I think a
involved.
lot of times too, when we look to those mechanisms of like that movement like that, I think they don't want to go after the intangible part, which is the mental side of that, which is how is like we just have to look at variables. What variable changed from a kid going from high school to college? What variable changed? The variable is the environment, right? The game didn't change that much. Yeah, sure, the zone got a little smaller. The mound arguably got better. The balls got better, right?
Mhm.
The competition sure got better, but the environment changed. It's not secure anymore. It's competitive, right? They are not handling the new environment stress
It's the
well.
brain.
Right, but we want to point to a movement-based problem because it's tangible. And I think a lot of times, Jordan, when we talk about data, we need a number to go to that. And that's the biggest problem with the mental side of it is you're not going to get that. You're not going to get a number. And largely too, when you do questionnaires or anything like that, right? The reason they are terrible in research is just because most people are answering how they want to be perceived, not how they actually feel. And you run into this issue where if you don't have somebody on your staff that has the capacity to make themselves empathetic, not sympathetic, but empathetic to what this person is going through, then they're going to find it very difficult to sort of work with them and help them through that process. But, you know, ultimately, it needs to be, as you're talking about, Jordan, this blend, the blend of we have this information, and that's, again, we can use the arm care, and this has happened plenty of times. Your force plate numbers are great. Your arm care numbers are great. You can throw a bullpen at XYZ velocity and you can hit all your targets. We go in a game and we can't. Are you ready? Are you ready to become aware of this and now start to just let's work on the mental side of this? Because they have to be willing to do that. If they're not, it's never going to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's just interesting the timing of this because I had all my guys yesterday. We had a bunch of guys out, and I told them it's like, you guys kill it in practice, and then some of these guys that I have are struggling in competition. And I said, it's not a mechanical change you're going to make. There's no magic drill you're going to do. There's no magic lift that you're going to do. It comes down to confidence. And it's like, I'm asking all
100%.
these guys, how do you get confidence? Like, well, I have to have success. Well, how do you get success? It's like, well, preparation. You have to have a skill set to get in there. So it's like, but there's also steps you need to start taking to evaluate your own mental process and understand there's some things you need help with. And you may need to go seek something out. It's not always just, and if all your arm strength numbers are great, it's like, yeah, maybe we can fix some things here and then that give you more mechanical consistency. But a lot of that is just your ability to go, you know what, I need to get some outside help here.
Yeah, and confidence is the greatest drug on the planet, right? It can make anybody do anything and feel like they can conquer the world. The interesting part of that is the process is very difficult, very muddy. It's not really visible, right? So the athlete, the reason they don't want to go down that path, or they don't initially choose it, right, is they're not really sure how successful it's going to be. And I think you run into major problems when you have an athlete who believes the mental state is is finite, meaning like I have an end goal to get to, right? Like throwing harder, we all kind of know that triple digits is going to be this end point right there, whether it's 100, 105, 102, whatever. That's like where you got these high level throwers chasing. But when it comes to the mental side, there's no finite stop of working at it. You're in a constant process because what happens is I am able to handle or be confident at this level. But should I rise, that next level of competition is drastically different. I need a totally different stimulus to get me back present.
Mm-hmm. Man, we've hit on some really unbelievable things, and I know we're coming up on our time, but I wanted to close with a quote that you gave me,
Mm.
uh, Nick, that I think is really good, and I'm going to read it. Um, you said, "We know we need velocity, but we do not want to accept that this comes with great responsibility." And I think that part really kind of summarizes this podcast in the sense that we've talked about the pivot points, the assessment elements, right? The interaction between, fast arm action and strength, and then the application of how this is applies, and the motivational components. Where do people find you? I mean, they could go, they could see you on LinkedIn. I know I've, been able to see your resume and everything else that you've done. But pretty much the website, I mean, across what social media platforms, if people want to go and, see what you're doing over there, I'd like to let them know.
So obviously on Instagram, we're at Velo University. TikTok, I think, is at VeloU or at Velo University as well. I'm not really sure. I'm not a social media guy. Unfortunately, I'm all over it with our brand, but I'm not the one on there. But what I would say is also too, I think sometimes people feel like when they see you on these platforms, right, that you're unreachable, which I never want to be the case. Like, we are constantly learning. No, we are not like, we have not figured everything out. We've gotten a lot of things right. We've gotten a lot of things wrong. That's why we'll get more right in the future. And like, I just think ultimately bringing it back to that point, responsibility of throwing harder, you need to accept the fact that I have to throw harder. And then you need to accept the fact that every time you do achieve these levels, you are a different person that comes with different responsibilities and different things you have to attend to. And if you want to be a 90+ mile an hour thrower, then you need to act like that person before you become that, so that when you do, you're already prepared.
Yeah. Love it. Couldn't have said it better. Jordan, you got anything to add, my brother?
No, I mean, I'm in my standard fashion. I take us in a random direction that I know we probably weren't trying to go down, but I took some good notes. I always like it when I get to take some good notes and learned a lot. I wrote down your quote there at the end.
It's great.
But I just can't reemphasize enough what Nick just said there is it comes with more responsibility. And most guys, it's like giving the keys to the liquor cabinet to a 16-year-old and then also the keys to a Ferrari and expecting them not to wrap it around a light pole. So with Velo, you got to earn the responsibility. So I think that's awesome.
Awesome. Well, until next time, everybody has been listening. Stay tuned. And thanks again, Nick. This was a great, great podcast.
Yeah, I appreciate it.